Okay. Michael, I think we are live.
Hello all. Sorry for waiting. Hello all. Am I audible? Just can someone give us some thumbs up if we are audible?
Yes.
The people who are watching right now on Facebook, can someone give us some thumbs up or reaction something so we can understand. Are we live or not? I mean, our audio is
Yeah.
proper, video is proper. Someone give us some thumbs up or something.
I am watching Facebook. You are live on Facebook.
Yeah, we are live, Ramdas.
Okay,
So we
sir.
can start the session.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ninth session of PSF's lockdown lecture series. Today, we have a much awaited guest today with us, Michael Roberts. And Michael Roberts will be talking on pandemic and economic crisis. Welcome, everyone, once again to the session. Today, on this session, Michael Roberts will be talking on pandemic and economic crisis, the topic which was being discussing in the world currently. And Michael Roberts is one of the foremost contemporary Marxist economists who is living in the world. And we are very pleased to have you here, sir. Welcome you to the PSF's lockdown lecture series. Today, our session will be chaired by Professor T. Jayaraman. Introducing Professor Jayaraman will be a task for me. Professor Jayaraman has been with Progressive Students Forum, has been the professor in Tata Institute of Social Sciences before. But currently, Professor Jayaraman is the senior fellow at MS Swaminathan Research Foundation. And I welcome Professor Jayaraman to the session. And I request sir to handle the session from now on. So, all yours.
Okay. Thank you, Ramdas, and thank you, students of PSF, for arranging this lecture. I am particularly honored to be chairing the session by Michael Roberts. Michael Roberts is a leading Marxist economist, in the world today. There are many economists who claim they are Marxists, but I think, Professor Michael Roberts and I may say a group of economists with whom he interacts frequently are among the leaders in this. I wouldn't call it a field or a discipline, are among the leaders in being Marxist economists. Okay. He has had a long career as a professional consultant in the city, as it is called, the financial sector in the city of London. But I think a lot of us know him through his incisive writing. He has a book, World in Crisis, edited with a colleague. He has another valuable book called The Long Depression. He has also a very sort of lovely introduction to Marxist economic theory in part of Marx at 200, I think it is called. And this is a book that I would encourage all of you to read. The Indian edition is fairly inexpensive, and I'm sure students can read it. I'm not going to, I might just say that perhaps the distinctive aspect of Michael Roberts' work is the close attention that he has paid to Marx's theory of crises. linked, of course, to the central notion in Marx of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Now, there has been, of course, a long tradition of writing on this subject, but I think one of the distinctive features of Michael Roberts' own work on Marx's crisis theory is the manner in which it is related to contemporary data. It is based on data. It is driven by data and information from the political and other spheres, and he puts together, therefore, an insightful approach to these issues, which I think mark him out among the leading Marxist economists of our time. So with no more ado, let me hand it over to Michael Roberts. Welcome, Michael, and we look forward to hearing you. Off you go.
Well, thank you, TJ, for a wonderful introduction. The person you described seems absolutely marvelous. I do hope that I can match up to the description, and that this lecture and discussion that we're going to have afterwards, I hope, on the immediate pandemic crisis and its impact on the world economy will be useful to viewers and members of the Progressive Students Forum, so that we can learn to understand better about what's going on and what's likely to happen in the future. That's very important for us in order to grasp what things we need to struggle for and fight for on behalf of working people around the world and in the labor movement. So to do that, I'm going to present you with a number of graphs. This is Michael Roberts' forte. He likes a lot of graphs. And so I'm going to give you an array, and if I can share this with you now, hopefully we can pick it up. And hopefully you can all see that. Perhaps TJ can raise his finger if he can see that. So here we are on the 30th of April. We have a position around the world where there are now millions of cases of this coronavirus, which has hit the world in all parts of the world. It's a pandemic, so it's spread across the world. And we also have an increasing number of deaths, particularly in the United States and Europe. We have increasingly also cases arising in other parts of the world into Latin America, Asia, Southern Asia, India included, which we'll deal with, and also to some extent in Africa. So that this is spreading across the world and it's not over yet. So we need to analyze what it means and also how it's impacting the economy. Now, if I can just get this to work. Yep. You can see that we start with this particular virus, and the question is often asked, is this really like a flu? I mean, is it no worse than a flu? We have flus every year, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, but also elsewhere, usually in the winter period. Lots of people die from flus, particularly elderly people, and the influenza remains, among other diseases, an important contributor to the annual deaths in the world. Some people argue that this flu, that the current coronavirus is much like the flu. Well, the first thing to say is that all these pathogens, including flu, have become much more prevalent in the last decade or so because of the increasing connection between human beings into the vast parts, more remote parts of the world, into nature, into the forests, into the areas where there is wildlife, particular wildlife which has held many of these pathogens for thousands of years. And now through the inexorable expansion of human activity, logging, fossil fuel exploration, urbanization in general, these wildlife species with these pathogens have come much closer in contact to human beings. And it's spreading through the industrial farming of animals in close areas, which has led to these pathogens transmitting themselves from the wildlife to industrial farmed animals into human beings. And we know in this particular virus started it seems, in a wildlife market, or at least in an area around the wildlife market in Wuhan, in Hubei province in China. But that's a similar thing, not just in China, but elsewhere, with the development of markets. And why are there wildlife markets? Often because poorer people find it difficult to get food from the industrial farming process, and they look to find other ways to provide them with sufficient food. And wildlife catching, which has also become a market that capitalism has generated, has become more prevalent, and that's led to the risk that these pathogens will spread into human beings, as they've clearly done. And it's not like a flu. We look at the infection rate of COVID-19, this particular virus, it's 2 or 3 times more infectious than the annual flu. It incubates over a longer period, which is dangerous because it means we don't know it's happening until it's already hit us and it's spread around. And the hospitalization rate for COVID, if it's severe, is much greater than it is for flu, maybe 6 or 7 times more. And as far as we can tell, the fatality rate of people who get the infection on a global scale is coming in after lockdown at around about 1%, or maybe a little less. But if that was to spread to the mass of the population at a 1% mortality rate, something like 6, 7, 10 times more than the annual flu, then millions of people would be likely to die. Now, this disease and other pathogens have been brought to the attention of governments around the world for some time. We can go back several years, but the World Health Organization has been warning the danger of these pathogens be turning into pandemics around the world and infecting human beings, as previous ones have had. But governments have really ignored this. They've taken the chance that nothing's going to happen, it's not going to be dangerous, and they don't need to prepare or spend any money on it. Just only in September, the United Nations Global Preparedness Monitoring Board pointed out that preparation by governments is totally inadequate, and the pandemic is coming, and unless they do something about it and get ready, the health systems are going to be overwhelmed, and this could escalate into a disaster. Well, here we are just a few months later in the middle of such a disaster. At the same time, it was worth considering that over the last 10 or 15 years, when these pathogens have become much more serious and spread on a pandemic basis, that nothing has really been done to use resources to find out more about them and to prepare the vaccines that could save us from serious illnesses and disease around the world. Vaccine is obviously the answer. There is no vaccine for this new virus, and even the vaccines for influenza are not good enough because pharmaceutical companies around the world are not interested in developing vaccines to stop the impact of pandemics. They're much more interested in more profitable things like heart medicines, so-called cancer treatments, tranquilizers, and so on, which make profits. Spending a lot of money on antibiotics and antiviral research doesn't make any money, although that's what would benefit public health. So part of the problem has been not only that governments did not prepare, but they also that the research has not been done by the big capitalist pharmaceutical companies around the world because it's not been profitable. So we have a position where 20 to 60% of the population could catch this virus and have started to do so. The death rate, that I say, will vary depending on the level of lockdown, which we can discuss in a minute, but is certainly coming in at around about 0.5 to 1% of everybody who's infected, probably by the time we get to the end of it. The actual case mortality rate is much higher than that, but if you were to argue that it spreads across a sufficient number of the population, then it's going to end up at around about 1%, 10 times more lethal than the annual flu rate. And that sort of level of cases and hospitalization just is overwhelming, or likely to overwhelm, most healthcare systems in the world, as it's proved to be the case, because they will not have no capacity for dealing with this, no testing, no contact and trace, no intensive care unit beds sufficient to deal with a huge increase in the number of people becoming ill and needing hospital treatment, particularly old people who can hardly move very much. And as I say, with no vaccine, then this situation could continue for some months or even longer ahead. So here is a graph which tells you, for those people who are skeptical about this, that the blue part of this graph is the normal annual mortality rate in various countries. And you can see per thousand of population how many people die in a year in these different countries. If this coronavirus pandemic was allowed to spread without any containment, without any control, and without any protective measures, then it would more than double in many countries, or at least double the amount of people who would die. So that's the sort of impact, and it takes, depending on how far up the dotted white bit you can go to the top, you could have 35 or 50 million deaths in this pandemic. But of course, that's not what's happened. Health systems and governments and everywhere else have desperately tried to contain the impact of this pandemic. And the little red blocks show you how successful they've been. If you take Spain or Italy, you can see they haven't been that successful. There's been a lot of deaths, way above the normal rate. And in fact, only this week, figures are now coming out across the board in many parts of the world, how much increase there has been in excess deaths over the annual normal annual deaths, even with the lockdowns and containment policies. Another argument presented often is that, well, only the old and sick die from this. 80% or more die if they're over 70, if they get it seriously bad. If you're a child under 9, nobody's dying. If you right up until you get to 50 or so, hardly a high percentage have died, even from those who've been hospitalized. So a vast majority of people infected, young people, will have no symptoms at all, and if they do, it's very mild. So what's all the fuss about is the argument. Well, leaving aside the question of whether it's right to let the old and the sick die, which I have to tell you, I work in financial circles, and within financial circles, quietly and privately, a lot of financial executives and people who advise governments and so on say, well, look, if all the old people and the sick people die from this, we can boost productivity because these people cost us money and they produce nothing. So in some ways, it would be better if they were culled from the world so that we had a more productive human population. This is an old theory, students, from Thomas Malthus in the early 19th century, that there was no way to improve the lot of anybody, the majority of people, because there were too many people. It was better to let plagues and other things cull all the unfit, the people who are not able to cope, and then you'd have a better productive workforce. And that has to be done progressively. This disgusting and grotesque theory still has an echo, even now, amongst people who claim that it doesn't matter if the old and sick die, and we should do little about it and let the young people just be infected. However, that's not a view that's possibly politically acceptable for any governments. And also it's just overwhelming hospitals across the world or in health systems, particularly in those countries that had the most cases. So the effort has been to try and flatten the curve, as it says. So in other words, if you look at this graph, the dark line tells you if you do nothing, you're going to have a massive increase in the number of beds that you need compared to that red line at the bottom there, compared to what most countries have got. Massive difference. So you have to contain this in some way, otherwise there will be people dying in beds outside hospitals all over the place. So from doing nothing, you have social isolation, keeping apart from each other, or you have quarantining people if they're infected, or you go further and start closing the schools and universities down, and you go all the way down to closing everything down at the bottom line, which is that lighter blue line, which has flattened the curve. That means that the infections are reduced and they're spread out over a longer period, and hospitals can therefore cope, and therefore they can deal with people, and people won't, not so many people will die. But of course, going all the way to a lockdown is a serious disaster. A lockdown could have been avoided, in my view, this is we could discuss, if hospitals had sufficient capacity in the ways that I've described it, protective equipment, beds, intensive care units, but also had massive testing facilities so you could test everybody to see if they've got this infection, and then you can quarantine them, you can trace anybody they've been in contact with, and you can drive down the spread of the infection in this way. Only a very few countries have been able to achieve enough testing. The countries that have done that the best and have used contact and trace and so on have been able to suppress the spread of this infection and reduce cases. Countries that haven't had that facility, and you can see some of the biggest countries in the world on the bottom of this league table, have had done the least testing and not been able to operate any testing bases. Also, they just haven't had the hospital space, because most health systems in the last 30 years have been drastically reduced in the spending, in the facilities, in the staffing, in order to save money for governments so that they can spend it on other things, whether it's weaponry or on helping capitalist profit. They're not prepared to provide a decent health system across the board. So there's no spare capacity. So any crisis like this, it just becomes overwhelming. So having the facilities and the capacity has not been there for most countries, nearly all. So the only solution then is to flatten the curve by a huge lockdown of everything that's moving. And this graph shows you the top line. If you flatten the curve from the not doing nothing at all, which is the red curve in the top part of this graph, to the blue curve, you can reduce the infections and the death. But the more you flatten the curve on the health front, the more you're likely to widen and increase the negative curve below for the economy. So the heavier the lockdown to flatten the curve, the more you're going to have a recession and a collapse in the economy. This graph, produced by another Marxist economist in Greece, demonstrates the trade-off now between lives and livelihoods as a result of this crisis. So now we're in a lockdown and a slump. We just had figures today with earlier in the week, United States down around about 5% in the first quarter, and we haven't even got into this quarter, which is going to be much worse. And Europe too, down by 3 or 4 or 5%, depending on the country. And we're going to see even worse figures, 20, 30, 40% in the quarter of the world now in the closure of, because these economies are being closed down. There are now nearly 3 billion people in some sort of full or partial lockdown measure. That's 81% of the world's 3.3 billion workers that are involved in this, so that a vast majority of people now, workers around the world, are facing a full or partial lockdown, a dramatic reduction in their incomes and their employment. So any sort of measure we've had from the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, and then all the private oil forecasters are saying anything like 5% reduction in global GDP in this current year, which will be way more than in the Great Recession of 2008. That was called the Great Recession. This is going to be even greater in its damage to the world economy. Outputs in the lockdown periods, which we're in now, would fall by 25%, maybe more, and up to 1/3 of all the sectors involved in the major economies would suffer. Every month that there is a lockdown, 2% in world growth is being lost. And this could exceed any collapse in global output that we've seen in the last 150 years. That tells you how severe it is. Of course, the hope is that it will only be short, just a couple of quarters, and then the pandemic will be controlled and we can recover and go back forward. Behind me, you can probably see a TV screen, which shows the current stock market happening. And I can tell you in the last few weeks, the stock market in the United States has been rocketing upwards for 2 reasons. One, central banks are providing loads of money into the banks and institutions so that they can keep their heads above water. And also, they believe that this lockdown will be over soon, and then world economies will recover, and it will be back to business as usual. We'll see whether that turns out to be the case over the next few months. But that is why we see now a stark difference between the figures we've had only in the last few weeks about the collapse in the real economy, in the services sector, and in manufacturing, and in trade, as I'll show in a moment, and the fact that the stock market thinks things will soon be fine. They're looking over the drop into the next mountain, and everything will be up and away again. But this is a huge supply shock. This graph briefly shows that this is not a financial collapse of the banks and financial institutions that we had in the Great Recession. No, it starts at the other end. It starts as a supply collapse. We have this so-called exogenous shock. I don't think it's a shock because we should have predicted these pandemics and done something about it, but it led to the shutdown of normal life and manufacturing. This huge supply shock has now spread to demand because if you're locked down at home, you can't spend any money. Perhaps you haven't got any money to spend, so there's a demand shock, and that could feed through eventually into a financial collapse for companies that can't sell, going bust, and then banks who have lent them money also coming in, getting into trouble. At the moment, the central banks are trying to shore up that bottom block on this graph, the financial shock, but they haven't been able to do anything about the demand shock or the supply shock which exists above this. And what above all it demonstrates, and I shall now bring in a short quote from Marx here, is that what matters in an economy is workers working. As Marx said, every child knows that if we stop work, even for a few weeks, let alone a year, then everything will perish. And it's obvious now. I live in the UK and I work in financial circles, I have done, and I was trying to list to myself, what are the important things that make our economy work and keep us going forward? Who are the workers that matter? The workers that matter are the health workers, the teachers, the people driving, the manufacturing workers, service workers of all sorts, retail shops and so on, all the businesses of that area. What occupations don't matter? They are finance executives, real estate executives, hedge fund managers, advertising executives, marketing executives, all those sorts of people. When they stop work, we wouldn't even notice. But the people that matter, when they stop work or are forced to stop work, we really do notice. And it's something worth remembering when you're thinking about who creates the value in our world in order to provide the things that we need and the services we require. As I say, we've got this massive lockdown across the world, huge falls in production now we can expect in this quarter now and going forward, which is affecting most countries, if not all. And this is an important point. Look at this red bit here, that the loss of production that's taking place now, if let's say it starts recovering into 2021, but you can see that that loss can never be recovered. Once you have that loss of output, loss of employment, loss of income, you might recover, but you have that gap permanently. It's like digging a hole in the ground that you can never fill again. You just have to climb over to the other side and the hole is still there. That's lost. All those resources have been lost to people around the world, particularly the people who need it most, the poorest people. And in particular, it is the so-called emerging markets that are taking a real tumble. For the first time since records have begun, the total amount of what is called the emerging markets or developing markets in the world are going to see a slump on average across the board. And that includes China and India in that figure for the first time. If you always take China and India out of the figure of emerging markets, you get a very relatively low growth rate. But now, even including them, we're going to have a slump in this year coming through as a result of this collapse in the world economy and the lockdowns. There's been a massive flight of capital away from the poorer countries who depend on, in a capitalist system, on an inflow of capital from the big companies and financial institutions. They've taken all their money back to where they brought it from, and there's been something like $100 billion disappearing from the emerging economies. And that means, of course, they have no credit, they have no facilities in order to expand, and it adds to the danger of their own currencies, and their financial institutions and their companies will collapse as a result of the flight of private capital. And that's not being replaced by any public capital. The IMF is giving some money, the World Bank's giving a little bit of money, but on the whole, no government, there's no international coordination from the richer countries to help the poor countries in this crisis. They're just being left to fend for themselves. And indeed, the only way they could probably get more money is by taking out more debt and loans, which could put them in a even more difficult problem later on, as we shall see. So millions of jobs have gone globally, according to the International Labour Organization, equivalent to 195 million full-time workers being wiped out by this pandemic and the lockdown. And the labor income lost something like $3.5 trillion maximum in 2020, so that huge amounts of people are going to be pushed back into poverty. According to Oxfam, something like 500 million people who were expecting to at least reach the barest minimum of $5 a day in 2020 are now going to be shoved back even deeper into poverty. And so we're seeing a huge 20% contraction and an increase in poverty that we haven't seen before for decades already. And then even at the most acute level, we are now entering the real danger of millions of people just being hungry, starving to death in a way that should not happen in the 21st century. It happens anyway, as you can see in years before, but we're going to see a doubling of the food insecure number of people who are basically in a position of starvation over the next year or so. Now, I want to talk about the impact of this lockdown, because you might say, well, it's all due to the lockdown. Well, I think we ought to realize that the capitalist economy on a world scale was not doing very well before we got to this pandemic. It was slowing down sharply. Europe was more or less stagnant. Japan was in a recession. Many important economies in the global south, like Argentina, Mexico, Turkey, and others, South Africa, were actually in a slump already. And even the United States was beginning to slow down to a very low rate. It's been the longest expansion in the history of the United States economy since the Great Recession ended in 2009. But it's also been the weakest expansion. Growth has hardly been more than 2% a year in the United States, less in Europe and Japan, and only emerging economies like India and China have had a reasonable growth rate. Most emerging economies have also had a very poor growth rate compared to the position before 2009 and the end of the Great Recession. So this has been a very weak growth, and it was beginning to come to an end. It was on a cliff edge. Here's a graph which shows you the growth was beginning to slow down, both in emerging and advanced economies. And then we had the pandemic, and now, of course, it's just dived off the edge of that cliff, but it was already teetering there. I want to make that point because sometimes we'll say, well, this is just a bolt out of the blue. It's not. Most economies were getting weaker and they weren't ready to deal with this pandemic. And we're now great to see, take the United States, something like a 10% fall in GDP over the next year or so as a result of this pandemic, at minimum. That'll be the largest decline in the 1930s and since the 1930s, and way more than anything seen even in the Great Recession of 2008-9. And why have most major economies been weak? Well, the answer, in my view, which as Chairman TJ has pointed out, is something I'm always bringing home to people in my work, is that underneath the movement of output, employment and incomes, the key question for a capitalist economy is whether it is profitable to produce, to invest and employ people. That's the only reason they produce things. The big motor car companies around the world don't produce cars just because people want them. In fact, they wouldn't do that. You've said, well, I want a car. Okay, I'll produce you one. No, they only produce it if it makes a profit for them to do so. That is the nature of the capitalist economy. They compete with each other to get a bigger share of the market and a bigger amount of profit. And they use their workforce and they try to keep the costs of the production down with their workforce as much as possible in order to make a profit, to accumulate that profit, partly to reproduce more things, but also to have a very good life and be a billionaire. So profitability is key to capitalism. And if you look at this figure, this is a measure of the major economies' profitability over the last 50 or 60, 70 years. And you can see that on the whole, profitability is really quite low compared to where it was back in the 1960s, with big fall. The recovery during the last 30 years, which workers have really had to take a hit for, has been relatively limited. And now profitability is very, very weak. And as we led up to this crisis, it suggests that they were in no position to cope with a major collapse in the health systems and the economies and the lockdown. In fact, if we look at global corporate profits, not just the profitability, that's the amount of profits per investment, but look at the total amount of profits had actually ground to a halt in the major economies as we entered the pandemic. Already, the world economy was about to enter a slump of some proportion, but now, of course, with the pandemic of major proportions. And part of the problem to overcome that low profitability was that companies were increasing their debt, they were borrowing more, they were issuing bonds, they were taking loans from the banks, they were trying to keep going, particularly the smaller companies, they had to take a lot more debt compared to what sales they were making in order to keep moving. And that has increased the weight of burden on them. If anything should go wrong and they're left with huge amounts of debt, they have to pay. And if they default, then the banks and the borrowers of that, lenders of those debts will also be in trouble. In emerging markets, we've seen a dramatic increase in debt while growth has been slowing down. There's a cross scissors there, which suggests that most emerging economies are now in serious trouble as a result of the pandemic. And here is a graph I've just done recently on India, which is interesting. This would require a lecture on its own, but let me just show you that we can see from the period of the post-independence, we see, just like everywhere else, a sharp drop in the profitability of Indian capitalist sector, the capital, right down to the early 80s, and then the recovery in that profitability through globalization and the expansion of the neoliberal recovery that also existed around the world, but also since the Great Recession, a generally depressed level for profitability, although in the first couple of years for the administration of Modi, there was a recovery as they applied measures to try and boost capitalist profitability at the expense of workers. But on the whole, profitability is nowhere near as high as it used to be back in the 60s in India. And that means even a country like India, which has been one of the more successful, expansive emerging economies, has got the same difficulty when it comes to profitability. And we see that now in the slump in growth in India, dramatically down from the 6 or 7% rates claimed by the government back in the 2016, 2017, although there are many people who argue that that's not accurate. But now, even on the official figures, growth just before this pandemic had dropped quite significantly to 4.5%, a very low figure by Indian standards over the last 10 or 15 years. And here is the measure of by the IMF only this last week of where India's growth rate is going. They expect the growth rate of 4.2% in 2019 to drop to under 2% this year. I think that's probably optimistic, but nevertheless, that's a demonstration of how severe the pandemic and the lockdown and the collapse in global economies is hitting India. Of course, they expect a recovery in 2021. We'll see if that bears that out. But even that bit with the green line down there demonstrates how much has been lost already in the Indian economy as a result of this crisis. Now, the risk for India, for me, is still there from the COVID-19. Yes, it may be less than in other countries, but even so, if 65% of the population are infected, which is the so-called level that would happen without any action, without a lockdown or any containment, even if India has a lower death rate than other countries because it's a younger population, still 2 million people could die from this pandemic. And remember, only 8% of the population may be old, but they still face real dangers of losing their lives as a result of the pandemic. And when people are so poor, that obviously increases the very great likelihood that they will be infected and suffer severe illness or even death from that process. And many young Indian people may be young, but if they're poor, and if they're not able to have a good diet and a good healthy existence, then they're even more liable to getting a severe impact from the coronavirus. Heart disease in India is twice that of Italy, and respiratory diseases are one of the highest in the world. And 1 in 6 people in India is subject to diabetes. That's a huge figure. These are all dangers. So elderly Indians can also still catch it from younger ones. So India is not safe from this pandemic. It's not safe from this pathogen, from this virus. And anybody who says so is not looking at the facts. Here's the very latest figures on daily deaths in India. You can see that it's not really coming down at the moment. There is still a gradual increase in the number of deaths per day. The rate of deaths per day might be increased, might be declining a little, but daily deaths are still well up from where they were just a month ago. So things are not under control in India yet. There's been no mass testing in India. They have very few respiratory systems, very few beds for isolation, very few doctors for the number of people who might be involved, very few hospital beds. It's okay for the rich and elite to barricade themselves in their homes, but for the poorest and most vulnerable in the slums, they have to live cheap by jowl, and they're really in a difficult position of catching the infection. And it's not just the slum dwellers, but it's also ordinary working people in the cities in India where both people are working, only afford the tiniest rooms and they need to work. They are also at severe risk from catching the virus or from losing their jobs. India is one of the most unequal countries in the world when it comes to wealth. The top 1% own more than 50% of India's personal wealth. The top 10% own nearly 80% of India's personal wealth, which is only beaten by countries like Russia and Thailand on this list. So India is more unequal in terms of wealth than the United States is. And that's the worst of the most advanced countries, capitalist countries in the world. And the slum levels are huge in a country like India. Number of people living in slums, over 100 million, which is way more than some other countries there. Maybe only 24% of people living in the cities, some people are higher, but it's still a huge number indeed. And they are at risk at all times in this crisis. And then what is the Indian government doing about this crisis? I had a quick look to see how much they were spending on handling the pandemic and the emergency situation. Here is from figures directly from the IMF this last week, which shows how much each country is spending both in providing loans and injections and guarantees to the banks and companies, and how much it's spending, the orange bit, on perhaps providing support for households and for hospitals and the health system. And you can see countries like France, England, perhaps paying 10, 15, 20%. If you just look at the orange bit, which is probably more important, you can see some countries are spending 5, 6% of GDP on trying to cope with the pandemic on top of what they normally spend. But where is India? India is right down the bottom in terms of spending and in dealing with this pandemic from the government. Only South Africa, which is in a serious economic situation, at least on this graph, is lower, according to the IMF. The Modi government is spending little on the emergency. It's got a fiscal deficit of hitting 10% of GDP, and it's unable or unwilling to borrow any more for emergency funds. That's because it has a huge debt to GDP ratio, 70%, and most within the country itself, not so much external debt, but public debt, and that's going to increase more. And so after this crisis is over, you can expect your government to attempt to squeeze back the increase in debt and so on that's taken place. It needs to spend more, but it's spending less than 1% of GDP on trying to handle this crisis. I'll skip this one, but you know more than me whether Kerala, which is argued, has done better than elsewhere in other parts of India because it's organized its health system in a better way. I have no idea whether that's correct, but that's what we're getting over in the West. You can tell me more. And the health minister there, they claim to have the best health care system in India, and that they were able to keep with life expectancy higher and a healthy community, keep the results of this pandemic lower. Finally, Chair, I just wanted to discuss what's going to happen. Are we going to return to normal after a few quarters, as the stock market in the United States believes? Well, here's an indication of how far away now the US economy is from its previous trends in the 20th century. When the Great Recession hit in 2008-9, real GDP per capita fell, and then there was, as I said before, a very slow recovery, much lower than trend, and there's no sign that it would return to trend at all during the period of 2010-2020. And here is a measure of world trade by the World Trade Organization, which points out that the same thing happened in 2008-9. There was the blue dotted line was the trajectory of world trade growing every year. This is very important to emerging economies. Then there was the slump in 2008-9, but they set off on a new trajectory, not the old one, a much slower and weaker one, the yellow dotted line. And now with this pandemic, we're going to slump again, and quite likely we'll have a new lower trajectory for world trade. So when we come out of this crisis, many economies, particularly those that depend on world trade and manufacturing and selling commodities around the world, and then software and all the other things which many emerging economies attempt to sell to the more advanced economies and to each other, if trade is drastically reduced, which seems likely now, particularly if the lockdowns continue and there is no restoration of what used to be called the global value chains, then there'll be no return to normal. We could be on a lower trajectory forever, or at least the foreseeable future in world trade. That is why I consider that the last 10 years before this virus, I call a long depression, because it was low growth compared to previously, low investment, low productivity, wages kept down in many countries as a result. Now it looks as though we're about to enter another leg for this long depression. In the 19th century, there was a long depression from about the 1870s to the 1890s. 20 years it lasted, depending on the country. I think it seems to be that we're now about to enter another leg, maybe another 10 years of long depression ahead of us, where wages are suppressed, growth is weak, productivity is weak, investment is low, people can't get decent jobs at training and skills and incomes that combine with that. And the public sector will be under tremendous pressure to be squeezed by capitalism to pay for this pandemic. That's the situation we're likely to enter in the next period. So to sum up, Chair TJ, just a few lessons. It's capitalism that generated these crises. This isn't shock. It's not due to nature. It's due to the environment of industrial farming, climate change, and all the other things that should produce these pandemics and pathogens that have spread. The market has failed to cope with this. Everywhere governments based on capitalist markets have failed abysmally, whether it's their pharmaceutical companies or their cuts in the health service. And they've had to intervene in the most emergency and direct way rather than prepared for this. And the workers that have been most exposed are those who do the job. They're the most important ones whom we rely on, and they are the ones that have been most exposed to the crisis and the infection, and they're the ones that we're really valuable in the economy, not all the people making their money in the stock market. And the total failure of healthcare systems, private and public to some extent, and the big pharma, what we need around the world coordinated is a free public health system with investment in research and productions of medicines and vaccines to ensure that these pandemics, when they come again, can be dealt with in a much more efficient way where the loss of life is minimal. And instead of bailing out big business and the banks, which is what the big economies around the world are starting to do, we need to take over these companies, plan them, and so that we don't return to the position where we just go back to the normal position of profit being the driving force for banks and so on. I mean, it's staggering to me that a company like Amazon, which is now making huge amounts of money, $10,000 a second by delivering things around the advanced economies, should be publicly owned a company. This is a company that requires control by the democratic decisions of the people, planned for, like mail and broadband, social media. These should all be public operations so that it meets the needs of the population and not just make profits for a few. And above all, for the poor countries, it's time that we cancel the huge debts of which they're burdened upon, and we shifted profits out of tax havens back into the governments so that they can use the profits of the big multinationals to help publics improve and maintain public services. That is the lessons we can learn from this. This is not going to be an easy period, and it's not going to come out very quickly. And we in the labour movement and working people must recognise the things that we need to do and struggle for once the lockdowns and the pandemic is over, as capitalism will try to return to business as usual once it is over. Thank you, TJ.
Thank you, Michael. That was a marvelous lecture. I'm very happy that you covered so much ground, I think, both from the world and India. So I have a couple of questions, but I'll keep them aside. I think there are a lot of people out there with questions. So here are a few uh, questions. So one of the first goes, what are the root reasons for collapse of the capitalist healthcare system in this COVID-19 epidemic? You partly answered that in your talk, but you could elaborate. What are the root reasons for the collapse of capitalist healthcare system in this pandemic? You have to unmute yourself.
I'm just suffering a massive storm outside the where I'm sitting, thunder and lightning. So the question was a little bit lost. Something about the capitalist system. I apologise for that, but I can assure you that nature is fighting back against me at the moment. If you could just try again, and perhaps you want to take 2 or 3 questions so we can answer them all like that.
This one. Why do you? So the question goes like, what is the reason why this capitalist healthcare system has collapsed in this pandemic?
Right. You want me to do that now?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, as I think I argued in the presentation, that capitalism has regular crises. This is not unusual. If we look at the history of capitalism, which is the private profit system, industrialized for the accumulation of capital, which has spread from the original countries where it started in Europe, Japan, and United States. It's spread around the world as a global system of production for profit and investment for profit, not for people's needs. That system of competition between capitalist companies to achieve it leads to recurrent crises on a regular basis. Why is that? What do I mean by crises? I mean a collapse in production, collapse in investment, people losing their jobs, situation where there's lots of goods that are being made, but nobody can buy them because they haven't got any money, and lots of people unemployed. That's called a slump. That situation happens on a regular and recurring basis in capitalism. It has done so for 150 years. So clearly there's something in capitalism that causes these recurrent and regular crises. So the scientific analysis of that, which Marx, amongst others, looked at, was to realize the very process of producing for profit rather than for people's needs, and the competition between capitalists for profit actually causes fall in the profitability. And this is the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And the law says that as capitalists compete with each other, they try to keep their costs down. The best way to do that is to expand the amount of technology and machinery, equipment they use, and relatively reduce the amount of wages and the number of workers that they're using compared to that. So there's a rise in the amount of expending on machinery and equipment relative to the amount of workers being employed. There may be more workers employed, but the relative ratio changes. And if you do that, then because only workers create value, if nobody works, as I showed before in the presentation, you don't get any value and you don't get any profit. So there's a tendency for the profit relative to the amount of investment that capitalists are making over a period of time to fall. So that tendency produces a situation eventually where the rate of profit falls to the point where the total profits fall, and then you get a slump. So this happens on a regular basis. And it was about to happen before this pandemic, in my view. At the end of 2019, we were heading towards a similar sort of crisis based on this falling profitabilities I showed in a couple of graphs. And then the pandemic hit us, which has absolutely increased the impact on relatively weakening capitalist economies and caused this big slump. So the pandemic is an extra tipping point on top of the general recurrent crises that capitalism can suffer. And that means when we come out of this, if the capitalism remains very weakened, then we have not changed anything at all. Recovery will be weak, growth will be weak, the depression that I described will continue. So I think that is the way I would answer that particular question.
I think in answering that one question, I think you answered some other very similar questions, which takes us to two questions which kind of fit together. In fact, for which you have already provided the preamble, if you wish. So one question is, will the situation go back to where it was before the COVID crisis? And the questioner says, not that it was great, but will we make it up there? Okay. And so has the COVID crisis worsened the rate of profit of various countries? But then there is another question which says that because of the massive job losses and many businesses shutting down due to the ongoing pandemic, this will act to restore the rate of profitability of capital. So, and then the questioner adds, what do you think this will mean for capitalism? No, I'll reserve the second part because there is another question very similar. So could you...
Vijay, this is a very, very good question from the viewers, because I've been thinking about myself, because Marx's law of profitability suggests that once you've had the slump causes workers to be laid off, capitalists to close down weak and old technology, to merge with weaker companies, and so whoever's left, the survival of the fittest, is actually in a better position to grow, and they've also got a lot of workers that they can employ more cheaply, so actually profitability would rise. That's the classic view of the boom and slump in the Marxist theory of crisis. You go in, the boom starts, profitability falls, eventually you have a slump. The slump creates the conditions for a rise in the profitability, and then production goes forward again in a cycle. So the questioners are asking quite rightly that if we have a massive slump now and jobs are lost, and perhaps a lot of companies will go bust, the weaker ones, maybe the stronger companies will be in a position where they can boost their profitability and then come out of the cycle strengthened, and we can have an expansion. I think it's a very good question. I've thought about it. I think there'll be quite a lot of tendencies like that. We'll see the Amazons of this world and other things benefit, while retail shops will collapse, because things will move on to, different sectors will gain out of this and different sectors will lose. But on the whole, I'm not convinced that we're going to see much of a dramatic recovery in profitability. There will be some, obviously, from the slump, but I don't think it's going back even to the levels that we've seen in the weakening period of since the Great Recession. And the reason for that is there's a huge amount of debt built up, which is sitting on top of a load of companies, and not just small ones. And it'll be very difficult for those companies to both pay and service that debt, particularly if interest rates should start to rise, whether they're zero or nothing at the moment. And also, if the interest rates rise, it'll cost them more, so that a lot of their extra profits are going to be eaten up by debt. To service that debt, unless there are bankruptcies of major proportions which spread across the world. But at the moment, the reason there won't be many bankruptcies, at least not as far as I can see, maybe they will, but central banks and governments are trying to avoid that. So they're trying to stop any collapse in the capitalist economy, which would lead to a cleansing of the system and a creation of a higher profitability. So we're going to get a weakened capitalist economy, still burdened by debt, propped up by central banks trying to pump money in and by governments giving them support. That somewhat happened after the Great Recession. And so we could go into a very stagnating, depressing, maybe even with some inflation coming back at the same time, a stagflation environment. I think on balance, that's how it's going to go. But I have to say, the questioners are dead right this is an issue that we need to think about more carefully, both theoretically and looking at the data, to make a judgment about whether this pandemic and the collapse in the world economy is so great that it could create conditions for perhaps a more sustained recovery for those who survive this crisis.
Well, you can see that people have been reading your blog, Michael. they really follow this stuff. So there are two questions that.
By the way, TJ, I'm going to write on this particular issue that the viewers have raised over the next couple of weeks.
Oh, very good. We look forward to that. So the follow-up questions which come naturally, and they are here, is what will it mean in the coming years for the struggle for a more equitable society? And there is one more which asks, and this is from a friend from Ireland. So welcome to Justin O'Hagan. So he asked, does Michael Roberts see any prospects for a renewal of the anti-capitalist left as a result of pandemic and downturn? So what do you think? Well, after that, we'll take the India questions after this.
Well, as the questioner points out, obviously recognizes that we're in a very unequal world. Most countries have very unequal distribution of wealth and income. And that inequality, by lots of scholars have analyzed over the last period, for the last 50 years, particularly since the 1980s, there's been a big increase in the inequality within countries, particularly in the advanced countries, but also in the so-called emerging economies. And between countries, the gap between the poorest and the richest has not really narrowed at all, if we're looking at the averages. Two things about that. If you take China and to some extent India, but even just taking China out of the equation, the gap between the poorest countries and the richest countries in the last 50 years has not really changed. In fact, sub-Saharan Africa has gone even further behind. What the result of that means is, I used to ask this question in meetings in the UK, which is a relatively rich country compared to most countries around the world. And I would say to them, who in this room thinks they are in the top 1% of wealth holders in the world? And nobody would put their hands up. But in fact, that is what they are. Majority of the people in that room, although they appear to have very little wealth, they've got a house with a mortgage, they've got a few other bits of savings, they are actually close to the 1 or the top 5% of wealth holders in the world, because there are billions of people who have no wealth at all. So the distribution of wealth is huge, both between individuals, globally, between countries and within countries. Will anything after this pandemic lead to a change in that? And is there any prospect for the left being able to make some changes in that? Well, I think it's going to be very difficult to see any changes unless we are able to mobilize and deliver governments which are prepared to make those changes, because it will come down to political struggle. There are two things I think about this. I was thinking about what happens in the workplace. I think there will be a real attempt now by capitalist companies to reduce the conditions of workers in the workplace from this pandemic. When people come back to work, they may find they're not got the same wages. They may find their conditions are going because the capitalist companies say, oh, well, we've had a terrible time and we can't pay you what we used to pay you, and we can't give you the same conditions, and we're not taking on so many. There's going to be that battle. So there's going to be a trade union battle or a workers' battle to preserve the conditions they had in 2019 when they come back to work. That's a defensive struggle. But on the political front, I think there could be an offensive struggle. How many governments are going to be able to resist the demand for a fully funded, adequate public health system that protects us from pandemics in the future? How many governments are going to be able to resist the demand for better public services, paying the workers who matter around the world to make sure that we have the public services that protect us? If the governments think that they can claim, because of increased debt, that all these things have to be cut back again, then there will be a major political struggle. And that's an opportunity for the left to reach out to millions of people who recognize the need for that change. And that could lead to significant public changes, perhaps an increase in the taxation of the rich, of the corporate sector, trying to stop these tax havens, and also to spend more money on public services than previously. One of the public services that we could get less spending on is military spending, which is still massive around the world. We cut that back and there will be more resources for civilian spending. So these are the sorts of issues, I think, where the workers' movements and the left have an opportunity after this pandemic.
So a couple of India questions, and there's a excellent question here. A person asking, India's monetary policy right now is to flood the liquidity into banks and markets. However, there is no investment sentiment. Do you think there is an alternative policy measures that can be undertaken by the central bank? And there is a political one second. There is a political one, little speculative perhaps, which says, why does India under Modi stand out as the odd man out in the pandemic, which you showed so clearly? Why does India stand out as the odd man in terms of public expenditure in the pandemic? And what, in your opinion, explains its extreme reluctance to undertake any kind of expansionary policy to provide relief in order to protect livelihoods as well as productive capacity? Okay. I must add here that in the Indian media, we've had a huge number of people, and it includes Raghuram Rajan of the World Bank and IMF. It includes Geeta Gopinath, chief economist at the IMF. It includes former governors of the Reserve Bank, and it includes political economists, includes everybody. Everybody has said, just spend. We need to spend. And there is a marked reluctance from the government to spend. In fact, we have very little idea of what the government intends in the first place. So what is their thinking? So that's the kind of background, but these are the two questions. So what would be
I think, again, the questioners have brought up two very important points. We're talking now about what can governments, capitalist governments and other governments do in this crisis short of getting rid of capitalism, which they have no intention of doing. So they basically have two policies. One, they can try to inject a load of credit and money into the economy, or using central banks. Central banks can just print money. They don't actually print notes anymore. They just put money into the government's accounts. They credit them with government extra money to the government accounts. Or they can go and buy all the bonds of the banks that hold, or governments hold, or corporations hold, and that cash goes into banks, governments and corporations, and presumably they are then held up and they don't collapse. So the policy of monetary policy is to ease us, is to pump a load of credit and money into it. This was done after the Great Recession. The idea is to stop a complete meltdown and collapse of companies and banks. And no doubt to some extent it will do that. It will keep those companies and those banks and those governments afloat. But is that money going to end up in actually improving the production, investment and employment in the real economy? And the answer is no. Most of that money will either just be stashed away or used in the speculating in the stock market, which is what we're already seeing at the moment. It doesn't end up through the intermediaries of the central bank and the banking system into the real economy. That was proved in the last Great Recession. It just ends up in speculative investment, not in a real investment. So it doesn't solve the problem. If you go on printing money indefinitely and there's no real improvement in production, even after this pandemic, what eventually will happen is that governments will face the possibility of rising inflation because there's no production, and yet there's piles of money trying to be spent in some form or other. The inflation may take place in financial assets, but it also could take place in the real economy on this occasion. But every government is doing this. They're trying to prop the banks up, prop the big companies up, to some extent the small companies, but mainly the banks and the big companies. But they're not doing anything else. The question is, what could they do otherwise? Well, the other policy is fiscal policy, which is the government spend money because the capitalist sector is spending nothing and workers are locked at home. So the government spends money to provide services, not just emergency services in this crisis, but afterwards to provide the basis for investment and growth. I just saw the figures today from India's infrastructure spending, which has collapsed. India has stopped spending on infrastructure across the board, very important for India, because it's been more worried about the collapse of its banking system and so on in the past period. So the Modi government is not interested in spending more money. Why are they the exception? As I showed on that list, I think there are two reasons for that. First of all, the attitude of the Modi government is that we want to boost the private sector. We don't want a government sector that grows. We don't want to spend too much money on it. Secondly, they've already got quite severe high debt levels in the government sector, and the deficit is relatively high. And if that continues, that's a burden on the capitalist sector. So they want to reduce the burden on the capitalist sector as much as possible. So they're not really prepared to spend too much money, even on the pandemic. They're hoping that because all you Indians are so young and so virile, you're not going to die. Well, as I tried to show in some of those graphs, that assumption is a very dangerous one to make. They're hoping to get away with it, and that even if people do die, it's only the old people, or the poor people, or sick people, and maybe they don't matter. It's a sort of Malthusian solution that your prime minister is offering, rather than spend money to save people's lives, or to spend money in the government taking the place of capitalism. I've written a number of posts on my blog where I pointed out that whenever spending of levels of 5 or 10% of GDP that many governments are thinking about doing is nowhere near enough to take the economies forward after this pandemic and through it. I talked about a war economy. In a war economy, production for military spending meant that governments intervened and swept the capitalist sector away, they directed them to do things or took it over, and spent 30 or 40% of GDP on investing in producing weaponry. We could convert that in civilian terms, that if government started spending 30 or 40% of GDP on public services, on investment and plans to boost productivity and technology after this in a sustained coordinated plan, then they could transform economies like India, but also the economies of the advanced economies. But 30 or 40% of investment by the governments means that capitalism is being replaced. And that is not something that's going to be acceptable. That is not business as usual. That is replacing business with something entirely different. And that is why a program of planning with investment and the resources being provided to do that by government spending is not going to happen. So instead, what we're going to happen is central banks will go on perhaps spending more money to keep governments afloat and to keep banks and companies afloat, with the danger, but will remain relatively stagnant, with the danger of inflation. So I'll finish on this point, TJ. There is some talk amongst economists, radical economists, that we don't need to overthrow capitalism or replace the capitalist system with a publicly owned planning system. All we need to do is just print money. It's called modern monetary theory. What you do, governments spend money and the central banks print it indefinitely. It doesn't matter about taxation. Forget about taxation. Forget about borrowing from issuing bonds. Just add money into the government accounts indefinitely until everybody's employed. So we do nothing about Amazon, we do nothing about fossil fuel companies, we do nothing about banks, we don't touch them. All we do is we pump money through the economy and keep printing it. Well, that very radical idea, which is quite popular amongst the left, at least in some of our countries, in the advanced countries, is now going to be tested, because it's exactly what many central banks are doing at the moment. We'll see whether it works.
Okay. So I think there are a couple of questions, one of which you have already answered and anticipated. One, shall we say, this one is a light one. Perhaps we should take it a little lightly. So somebody asked, does it mean a return to Keynesian economics post-COVID? God forbid we would say, but what's your take?
Well, that's those who read my blog know that I spend a lot of time trying to show the flaws in the Keynesian economics. For those viewers who know nothing about this, the general mainstream view amongst economists and government economic policy is that we should let capitalism move freely, let markets be untrammeled and unregulated, let the big companies invest and make their profits, and everything will be fine in a harmonious world. Well, of course, as we just discussed, there are slumps on a regular basis and inequalities on a permanent basis, which cannot be ignored. What happened when we get big slumps, like the Great Depression of the 1930s, other economists say, well, this is obviously not working. The market economic theory is rubbish. So Keynes was one of these. He said, what we need to do is that governments have to intervene to keep demand up, keep production up by government spending. Once we've got it up again, then capitalism can take over again. So the theory of Keynes was you have to intervene. You can't leave it indefinitely. Otherwise, you just have a permanent depression, which is argued in the 30s. So he was in favor of more government spending as a solution. I briefly discussed that before, where how you finance it. You can either print it or you can issue bonds or whatever, but more government spending is the solution. I would argue that that's not replacing anything to do with the capitalist system. It's just getting it out of its mess now for the next mess to come along. Nothing changes, but also it's not a solution unless you do it at a massive level, where you're basically replacing the capitalist system as in the periods of the Second World War. And I was just reading also in the case of the First World War, where a similar program of government spending and investment took place. So when capitalists are desperate, they hand over capitalism to government briefly in order to restore it. Keynes' view that maybe we could do it at a certain level. But even he admitted that it wasn't really practical to do so unless you had a dramatic change in the level of investment in the war period. So I don't think Keynesian economics is a solution to save capitalism, but that's its purpose. So first of all, if that doesn't work, then we should be looking to get rid of capitalism, not save it. But I say this a lot of time in my blog and in my books because Keynesian economics is the dominant view amongst the left, not just in general. In the labour movement, at least I don't think it's the case in India, but certainly in the case of advanced
Well,
economies.
it is partly true in India, as we have
The
spoken
main
about.
thing is to say those who are more radical and don't want to continue with market economics, the laissez-faire system of no regulation, advocate Keynesian economics, not Marxist economics. I go to conferences quite often, and I'm the only person who presents a Marxist view. Everybody else is a Keynesian. We're all Keynesians, including some people who used to be quite right-wing, because they can see, they look at that as to save capitalism. The aim is to save capitalism. I just remind viewers of some big Nobel Prize winners. Joseph Stiglitz has just produced a book which he calls Progressive Capitalism. So he wants to say capitalism has been rather bad recently, so let's make it more progressive with Keynesian policies. We get similar ideas from other people who say we want a better capitalism, a fairer capitalism, one that works capitalism. Well, my argument in my blog and elsewhere is actually much simpler. Let's just replace capitalism.
Okay. I think we have kept you here for a long while, and I think the major questions, there are some technical ones, so maybe they can put it up in the comments will be there on the Facebook Live page. So we'll send you the links and perhaps you could respond on a later occasion.
Yeah.
So with these words, I think, thank you again so much, Michael Roberts, for your lecture. For the viewers, please follow him if you want to know more of this. Follow his Facebook page, Michael Roberts blog. He has a blog called the next recession.wordpress, right?
That's
Yes.
right.
At the next recession, one word, .wordpress.com. And that's another place where you can see it has a marvelous resource. So I hope there are people here who will think about the very important issues that have been raised in today's lecture. And we hope this will be a dialogue. We hope we'll have you back again, Michael, on other occasions to continue this, what we started today. Okay?
It just goes to show that Zoominar and virtual connection is going to be a powerful way for us to communicate across the world instead of all that travel, eh?
Okay, that's
All right.
yeah, that's useful. Okay, so
All right.
back to the organizers. Thank you,
Yeah.
guys.
All right. On behalf of Progressive Students Forum, I would like to thank both of you, both our panelists. Thank you so much for taking out time. To Michael Roberts, apologies for last time, and Professor Jayaraman for this session. It was really insightful and an interactive one. Thank you so much, comrades. Red salutes. Taking to the next session tomorrow. It's our concluding session, so please be stay tuned. It will be at 7 p.m. Comrade Hemlata will be taking the session. It's on unity in resistance, labor movement, and the student struggle. She is the president of Center of Indian Trade Union, the first ever president in the entire movement in our country of labor movement. So please do stay, and thank you so much for once again, all of you. Thank you so much.
Bye, Michael. See you. I'll mail you. Bye, bye, Anuvrati. Bye,
Bye.
Ramdas.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Aisha. Bye, everybody.